The village of Ashwood lay shrouded in an eternal gloom, the sun never quite penetrating the canopy of gnarled trees that loomed above. It was a place whispered about in hushed tones by outsiders, a place where myth and reality blurred like the edges of a watercolor painting left in the rain. The villagers lived in an uneasy harmony with the fae that dwelled within the forest's heart. These were not the fairies of childhood tales, delicate creatures flitting about on iridescent wings, leaving trails of glitter in their wake. No, the fairies of Ashwood were something else entirely. They were tall and impossibly thin, their skin the color of moss and decaying leaves. Eyes glowed like embers within the hollows of their faces, and their voices were the rustling of dry leaves, the snapping of twigs. They moved unseen, unheard, whenever they wished it so. Fading into the shadows like smoke on the wind. Every 7th year, the fairies of Ashwood would collect their tithe. Someone in the village, never the same age or sex twice in succession, would be taken in the dead of night. The villagers whispered of the fairy queen, a monstrous apparition with skin as white as marble, hair as black as the void. They said she wore a gown woven from the very shadows themselves, and that her touch was as cold as the grave. They said that on the night of collection, her laughter would echo through the forest, a chilling melody that would curdle the blood in your veins. And when the sun rose the next day, another would be lost. The villagers paid their tithe. They didn't have a choice. They had heard the stories of what happened when the fairies were denied their due. They had seen the ruins of villages that had refused to pay the price, places where the trees grew twisted and grotesque, where the very air seemed to vibrate with a malevolent force. Old Man Thorn was the only one who had ever escaped the fairies' clutches. He was a grizzled, stooped figure with eyes that seemed to see right through you. He would sit by the fire in the village hall, his gaze fixed on something only he could see, his face twisted by some ancient horror. They said that when he was a boy, he had been taken by the fairies, and that he had stumbled back into the village a week later, his eyes wild, his skin as white as bone. He never spoke of what had happened in those lost days, but the villagers could see it in his eyes, a lingering echo of the terrors he had endured. They said that Old Man Thorn could see the fairies, even when they moved unseen. He could hear the rustling of their voices, the dry snapping of their twig-like fingers. And on nights when the moon hung low in the sky, he could feel the fairy queen's touch, as cold and lifeless as the tomb. So the villagers lived in fear of the fairies, those monstrous, otherworldly beings that lurked just beyond the edge of perception. They paid their tithe, and they prayed that they would never hear the sound of the fairy queen's laughter ringing through the trees on a night when their own child lay sleeping, unprotected. And they would glance at Old Man Thorn, huddled by the fire, his eyes fixed on some horror that only he could see. They would shudder at the thought of the terrors he had witnessed, the nightmares that still haunted him in his old age. For in the village of Ashwood, the fairies were not a myth, not a story to be told and laughed at. They were a reality, a presence that hung over the village like a shroud. They were a reminder that there were still places in the world where humans were not the masters, where other forces held sway. And they were a terror that would haunt the villagers until the end of their days, a chilling reminder of the horrors that lurked just beyond the reach of their senses. I still remember the night I decided to approach Old Man Thorn. The villagers had spoken of him in hushed tones, their voices barely audible over the crackling of the fire. They had spoken of his wild eyes, of the way he would stare into the flames as if seeing something that was not there. They had spoken of his twisted hands, of the way his fingers would curl and uncurl as if grasping for something invisible. And they had spoken of his voice, of the way it would rasp and crackle like ancient parchment paper. But it was not just the villagers' words that had sparked my curiosity. It was the way Old Man Thorn would sit by the fire, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the flames. It was the way he would rock back and forth, his lips moving as if in silent conversation with some unseen presence. And it was the way the shadows would seem to move of their own accord around him, as if they themselves were afraid to touch his twisted form. I had tried to ignore him at first, to pretend that he was just some harmless old man lost in his own world of madness. But I could not shake the feeling that there was something more to him, something that lurked just beneath the surface of his grizzled exterior. And so I had found myself drawn to him, my feet moving of their own accord, until I stood before him. He had looked up at my approach, his eyes glinting in the firelight, and for a moment I had seen something there, something that made my blood run cold. It was a spark of awareness, of knowledge that went far beyond the comprehension of mortal men, and it was a spark of not quite fear, but perhaps wariness. But then the spark had been gone, replaced by the usual vacant stare, and he had looked back into the flames, his lips moving once more in silent conversation with the unseen presence that only he could perceive. And I had been left standing there, feeling foolish and more than a little spooked, until a surge of instinct kicked in, and I took off running, the pounding of my heart echoing in my ears as I sprinted away from the shadows that seemed to close in around me. But my encounter with Old Man Thorn had left me with more questions than answers. Who was this man really? And what had happened to him in his youth when the fairies had taken him into their clutches? And how had he managed to escape when no one else ever had? I had tried to put it out of my mind, to focus on my daily routine and pretend that the encounter had never happened. But I could not shake the feeling that Old Man Thorn was the key to unlocking the secrets of the forest. And so I had found myself drawn to him once more, my feet again moving of their own accord, until I stood before him. This time he had looked up at my approach, his eyes glinting with a spark of wariness. And for a moment we had just stared at each other, the only sound the crackling of the flames. And then he had nodded, a curt jerk of his head. "You want to know what happened when the fairies took me?" he had said, his voice raspy and weathered. "You want to know what I saw in their court and how I managed to escape?" I had nodded, my mouth too dry to speak, and he had looked back into the flames, his lips curling into a twisted smile. "It was a night much like this," he had said. "The moon was full, casting a ghostly glow on the ground, but leaving the edges of the forest cloaked in darkness. And the fairies were out in force, their laughter and music echoing through the trees." He had paused, his eyes glazing over as if seeing something that was not there. And then he had continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. They came for me in the dead of night, their cold fingers closing around my wrist like a manacle. And they had dragged me deep into the forest, the trees growing taller and closer together until I could barely see my hand in front of my face. He had paused again, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. And then he had continued, his voice growing even softer. Their court was a place of terror and horror. I saw things there that no mortal man should ever have to behold, things that have haunted my dreams ever since. He had fallen silent, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the flames, and I had sat there, my heart pounding in my chest, for I could see it in his eyes, the echoes of what he had witnessed in the fairy court. And I knew that he was not mad, not as I had previously assumed. Instead, he was haunted, his mind shattered by what he had seen in those lost days. And then he had looked at me, his eyes glinting with a spark of knowledge. You want to know how I escaped, he had said. You want to know how I managed to break free of the fairies' clutches when no one else ever has. I had nodded, my mouth too dry to speak, and he had looked back into the flames, his lips again curling into a twisted smile. I did not escape, he had said. Not really. Instead, I was let go, returned to the mortal realm. He had paused, his gaze drawn to the shadows that danced in the corners of his mind, then continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. The fairy queen herself came to me, her face as white as marble, her hair as black as the void. And she had looked at me, her eyes burning with a cold fire, and then reached out, her fingers closing around my wrist like a manacle. He had paused again, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths, then continued. She had pulled me to my feet, her grip like ice, and leaned forward, her breath freezing the marrow in my bones. And then she had whispered a single word in my ear, a word that has haunted me ever since. He had fallen silent, his eyes fixed beyond the flames, and I had sat there, my heart pounding, for I could see it in his eyes, the echoes of what he had witnessed in the fairy court. And then he had looked at me for the last time, his eyes revealing the horrors etched into his very being. You want to know what the fairy queen said, he had said, his voice like a wisp of smoke, as if the very shadows were speaking secrets meant for no living ear. You want to know what word she whispered in my ear, a word that has haunted me ever since. I had nodded, my mouth too dry to speak, and he had looked back into the flames. She said mine, he had said. She said mine. And then she had let me go, sending me back to the mortal realm. Now, you know how I managed to escape, and what haunts me still. She never truly let me go. She'll be back for me one day. And so, I sit here, by the fire, not knowing if today will be my last. And now, you know why you must leave me be. Now, you know why you must never come back here again. I had risen to my feet, my movements slow and clumsy, and had turned, my eyes fixed on the door, and taken a step forward, and then another. I had not stopped until I was back in my own cottage, the door shut and barred behind me. And then I had leaned against the wall, a heavy pressure settling in my chest, for I had seen something in Old Man Thorne's eyes, something that had made my blood run cold. I do not know, and I suspect that I will never know for certain why they picked Old Man Thorne. For the fairies are not mortal, and their ways are not our ways, and we can but guess at the secrets that they keep, the knowledge that they have accumulated over the long centuries of their existence. But this much I do know. Old Man Thorn is not what he seems. He is not just some harmless old man lost in his own world of madness. Instead, he is a haunted soul, his mind shattered by what he saw in the fairy court. And so I will leave Old Man Thorn to his memories, his mind haunted by the secrets that he keeps, and I will try to put my encounter with him out of my mind and pretend that it never happened. But I know that I will not be able to forget, not entirely, for I have seen something in his eyes, something that has left a mark on my very soul. And as the 7th year grows close, I will stay far away from old Mr. Thorn.